For the better part of a century, the Irish have resisted foreign occupation, making their struggle for independence one of the longest lasting in world history. It's hard to exaggerate the deep roots which have underpinned the massive bloodshed that has characterized life in Ireland up to the very end of the 20th century. Ancestral history shapes the guiding principles of wars for liberation, and the Irish War of Independence, though massively overlooked, is no different. From the Anglo-Norman invasion of the 12th century to the days of Henry VIII and beyond, Ireland was plundered. By an accident of geography, Ireland would be the first experiment in a model for colonial conquest the world over. And thus, the history of Ireland shaped the history of the world to the present day. It wasn't until Queen Elizabeth's ascension to the throne in 1558 that English policy shifted from merely conquering Ireland to replacing the Irish. In other words, the British Empire conducted an earnest genocide of the natives. In 1566, Sir Henry Sidney arrived in Dublin to assume the role of Lord Deputy. Sidney, who described the Irish as a sort of barbarous people odious to God and man, would make it a priority to pacify the countryside. Upon his march on Cork in 1569, Sidney proclaimed he was burning all the corn that was gathered and spoiling the rest, and henceforth, the targeting of the food supply became a go-to resort. The curse of God was so great, and the land so barren both of man and beast, that whosoever did travel from the one end onto the other of all Munster should not meet any man, woman, or child, nor yet see any beast, but the very wolves, the foxes, and other like ravening beasts. Many of them lay dead, being famished. A combination of slaughter and starvation depleted the population thoroughly, and by the 1580s, the historian Richard Burleth estimated that the native Irish population would be reduced by 30%, the land wasted, and the towns laid ruin. Allow me to quote military historian Robert Asprey from his multi-volume history of guerrilla warfare, War in the Shadows. Terror is the kissing cousin of force, and, real or implied, is never far removed from the pages of history. To define and condemn terror from a peculiar social, economic, political, and emotional plane is to display a self-righteous attitude that, totally unrealistic, is doomed to be disappointed by harsh facts. Feudal government of the Middle Ages rested on force, as opposed to the people's consent, often on terror exercises through the man-made will of God reinforced by hangman's noose or executioner's axe. No student of the period can seriously condemn the protesting peasant as a terrorist. Whether a single peasant who in the furious frustration picked up a scythe and severed the tax-collecting bailiff's head from his body, or the group of peasants who grabbed pitchforks to stand against the king's soldiers, the effort, more often than not, was not terror, but rather counter-terror. Centuries of British rule also culminated in a period of terrible famines from 1845 to 1855, following the failure of the potato crop, in which 1 million died and 2 million fled. Those who remained lived in conditions unmatched for misery in Europe, except among Russian serfs. Another major historical event for Ireland came just a few years later, in 1866, when Swedish chemist Alfred Nobel stabilized nitroglycerin into a portable explosive, inventing dynamite. And just a year later, a group of Irish Republicans bombed Clerkenwell Prison in London, killing 12. By 1883, Irish Republicans were bombing London into oblivion, in what is now called the Dynamite Wars. In January 1919, a group of Irish volunteers received a tip that a shipment of gelignite, an explosive more powerful than dynamite, was to pass near the Salaheadbig quarry. For 5 long days, the men laid waiting in the shamrock green fields by the quarry. Finally, on January 21, 1919, a horse-drawn cart laden with 100 pounds of explosives appeared, accompanied by 2 armed constables of the Royal Irish Constabulary. The volunteers promptly shot them and made off with the loot. If there had to be dead cops at all, 6 would have created a better impression than a mere 2. And on that very same day, the Dáil Éireann, or the First Irish Parliament, issued a Declaration of Independence. It was at this time that the First Anglo-Irish War began, and a new ragtag force, calling itself the Irish Republican Army, had declared war on the British. Irish independence would never be attained by constitutional means. When you're up against a bully, you've got to kick him in the guts. Though the IRA wouldn't exceed 15,000 members and only had a fighting capacity of 3,000, Michael Collins, the de facto leader and national hero, would create a formidable army practically out of nothing. Fighters would be organized into brigades, battalions, and companies, as well as flying columns of up to 30 men trained in guerrilla warfare, particularly hit-and-run raids, terrorism, and assassination. In 1920, they killed 176 police, as well as 54 soldiers. They blew up police stations, military barracks, courthouses, and tax collectors' offices. Aside from direct action, they also waged psychological warfare. The police must not be tolerated socially. They must be shown and made feel how base are the functions they perform and how vile is the position they occupy. In order to effectively liquidate his enemies, Collins kept a personal team of 12 shooters known as the 12 Apostles. It began with a dozen members, but it later grew, after which it would simply be called the Squad. These were full-time paid assassins. At least 6 squad members were made available at any given time to be deployed for what they called extreme action. Collins justified assassination by stating, "We had no jails, and we therefore had to kill all spies, informers, and double-crossers." In retaliation, British troops and police officers rampaged through towns and burned homes and businesses, this only engendering greater support for the guerrillas, the usual pattern. This bloody conflict, which claimed thousands of lives, ended in considerable success for the Republicans, and through the work of Michael Collins, a peace was negotiated culminating in the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, leading to the partition of Ireland. The Irish Free State was born. Unfortunately for Collins, his support for the treaty cost him his life, as he was assassinated by anti-treaty partisans. When they heard of his death, 1,000 anti-treaty Republicans in a Free State prison spontaneously kneeled to recite the Rosary in tribute to a man who had been their leader before he became their enemy.